Let's get one thing clear before I dive into this topic. Yes, this is technically a report and not officially confirmed at the time of writing, but it is likely accurate, and even if this report turns out to be false, which is also possible, the closure of these stores will happen eventually, and because of that, I feel my points being made in this video are still accurate, and I think this is a valid time to talk about it. Anyway, on with the rest of the video. In case you hadn't heard the report, to briefly summarize it in a quick sentence, the PS3, PSP, and Vita stores are rumored to be shutting down. I think that is bad for preserving these classic games. For reference on these stores, you can buy PS1 and some PS2 games, along with games for each respective console. Video game preservation and re-releases of old games has been a major topic for generations. As time has gone on and technology has changed, re-releasing old games makes sense. You don't want to take out an NES just for Mega Man 1, so why not put it on a modern platform? And well, developers did and continue to. Nowadays, so many games get re-releases and some franchises get entire collections celebrating their history, sometimes including bonus content. Nintendo for a long time has been seen as one of the best for re-releasing their old games, even though during the Switch era they have really dropped the ball a lot. Xbox has their backwards compatibility program, which has saved a lot of games from being stuck on old hardware. It's even the definitive way to play plenty of games. Yet during the previous generation of the Xbox One and PS4, one company arguably lagged behind: PlayStation. A lot of PlayStation franchises didn't get re-releases on the PS4. You can stream some games through PS Now, but that isn't ideal, and some PS2 games got re-released on PS4, but the lineup isn't that huge and leaves a lot to be desired. However, during the previous PS3 and PSP generation, there was a brief glimmer of hope for re-releases of old games. PS1 and PS2 games were available for download. Was it perfect? Of course not, but no service for old games really is. However, this lineup included plenty of great games that otherwise wouldn't have gone to make the jump to this generation. Look at Xenogears, for example. Xenogears is a masterpiece and deserves to be played by as many people as possible. There's only 2 legal ways to play it right now. However, if the PS3, PSP, and Vita stores go away, one of the legal ways to play it will disappear, leaving the only other legal option to be purchase a physical copy for the PlayStation 1. And with that, you have to purchase an old piece of hardware and also be able to afford a game that's rising in price, and will likely jump in price once a physical copy is the only way to purchase it. Or how about Sony's own games? For example, Legend of Dragoon, another great RPG that is becoming inaccessible as time goes on. I really could keep listing examples. What about the Ape Escape series? Not all of those are playable on PlayStation 4 and 5. Sony has been dragging their feet with bringing legacy content onto their newer consoles. Of course, you can't bring every game over. That would be unrealistic to suggest. Plus, re-releasing old games isn't just as simple as grabbing the files and then putting them on the new console. There's a lot of work that's going to re-releases. However, I think it's work that is worthwhile. Introducing players to old games can create interest in older IP, or can serve as fascinating history lessons on IP. Plus, a lot of older games are still fantastic. We aren't entitled to re-releases of old games, of course, but making games more accessible is only a good thing in my opinion. It serves as a celebration of gaming as a whole and allows us to look back to the past of gaming and relive it. Old games deserve a place on new hardware, and the disappearance of old PlayStation games is not a good thing. It's an awful thing. Sure, some games get remakes, but not every game can get a remake. Remakes are expensive and time-consuming to make. Yes, the PlayStation 3, PSP, and Vita aren't exactly new pieces of technology, and digital stores do eventually need to close down. You can't keep servers up forever. But the problem is, a lot of these games lack re-releases on modern platforms. For a lot of the classic games on the PS3, PSP, and Vita, these are the last remaining legal options that are accessible to most people. Losing it is a huge disappointment. Eventually, the PlayStation 3, PSP, and Vita stores will have to shut down, but there is a way to reduce the harm of it. Re-release old games. Provide us a legal alternative to game these games, as there will be no other legal service offering plenty of these games. That's easier said than done, of course, but that's pretty much the main solution I can offer. There's a major benefit to everyone. We all get to relive or experience classic games for the first time, and PlayStation can continue to make their money. These games can get sold for $10 to $20 and people will indeed purchase them. What is concerning to me is I feel like PlayStation's attitude over old games and their own legacy is not great. While they sneak in Easter eggs or talk about how proud of their history they are, I mean, just look at Astro's Playroom, it's an entire celebration of PlayStation history. But a lot of these franchises are left behind with nothing on newer PlayStation machines. I'm not asking for every PlayStation series ever made to get a new game, or even for all of them to get re-released, since I imagine a lot of them are difficult to get re-releases for. Instead, what I'm asking for is for Sony to do a better job than they are right now, and at least put in some more effort. Things need to change for how PlayStation treats their legacy IP. As time progresses, this will only get worse as more consoles release and older games get harder to find working copies of due to how in the future there will likely be a lack of copies. We have unofficial ways to play these games, and I am so thankful for how emulation has allowed these games to remain alive, fully playable, and not be forgotten. But offering legal methods would be nice and more appealing. We are still of course in the better time of re-releases this generation than previous generations, but there's a lot of room for improvement. You cannot re-release every game, but there's plenty of games that should be and deserve re-releases. One of the main talking points I sometimes see brought up is how backwards compatibility isn't used by everyone. And sure, I'm not going to hide that. It's not a feature everyone uses, but backwards compatibility is useful for allowing people to replay old games between gaps of new releases, and allowing people to catch up on an entire series before the release of a new game in the series. I mean, it's a great way to build hype. Hey, are you excited for the new game? Replay the entire series. Even with dead franchises, re-releases hold value. They can build interest in the company or that specific IP, and later on lead to new games. Also, a game being old doesn't necessarily devalue the enjoyment of it. Old games can still be great. For example, my favorite game of all time turns 20 this year. A quote from Sony's Jim Ryan kind of describes my main concern. I'm going to break it into two parts for the purpose of discussion. First up, when we've dabbled with backwards compatibility, I can say it's one of those features that is much requested, but not actually used much. To be fair to this quote, I don't think a single quote should be what defines an entire perspective, and I do think there is some merit to it, but not a lot. Backwards compatibility is indeed not used by everyone like I mentioned earlier. It's not exactly a super popular feature that everyone uses. However, I don't think it's fair to say something like this with PlayStation. Yeah, of course backwards compatibility isn't super mega popular on PlayStation. It's barely pushed in recent generations. The PS2 could play PS1 games, and people look back at this feature fondly, except it also had its own problems with plenty of incompatibilities existing across the various models. The PS3 had backwards compatibility, but with all the different models of the PS3 and how the backwards compatibility changed, yeah, there is some wackiness to it. Though I will be fair and give PlayStation credit for implementing it there. How about the PS4? Well, it barely had backwards compatibility. That same backwards compatibility wasn't marketed well, and existing backwards compatibility was lackluster. Of course people aren't going to be super into backwards compatibility when it isn't done well. But Fuse, what about the PlayStation Classic, you may be thinking? Well yeah, what about the PlayStation Classic? It was too expensive for a lackluster lineup of games on a console that featured tons of weird decisions. It didn't sell super well, not because of people not wanting old games, but because it was an uninteresting product. To give PlayStation credit, at least their handhelds do a pretty good job at backwards compatibility. Long after this quote was said, the PS5 launched with PS4 backwards compatibility, and wow look, it's a heavily praised feature. Especially early on, backwards compatibility can help boost the reputation of a console when done properly and not overly complicated by incompatibilities in different console models, or being limited to a small library. It's a feature worth the effort. Plus it helps fill gaps, and especially when coming off a generation that's content filled as the PS4, that's great. Instead of starting from scratch and needing to rebuild the entire library, from day one there are a ton of games available to play. Or just look at the Xbox brand. I know plenty of people who, because of backwards compatibility, are being drawn towards the Xbox. There is an appeal to being able to play entire generations of games on one console. However, the part of the quote that annoys me the most is that, and I was at a Gran Turismo event recently where they had PS1, PS2, PS3, and PS4 games. In the PS1 and the PS2 games, they looked ancient. Like, why would anybody play this? My problem with this quote is that it feels like a complete misunderstanding of why people want to play old games. The quote feels like it mischaracterizes old games here and reduces them to just being old. Old games can still hold enjoyment and be unique in their own way. A game is more than just its age and how it looks graphically. It also comes down to its design, which is why people want to play these games. A lot of these old games have aged well in design. People aren't going to be concerned or bored by playing old games because of old graphics. Just look at a game like Final Fantasy VII. That game is ugly, but plenty of new people are introduced to it and have fallen in love with the game. These old games have value still. PlayStation is missing out on something by not re-releasing these games. This entire time I've been talking about just retro games. There's another big thing I'm leaving out. Games with DLC and download-only titles. Any game that relies on content being delivered through the store is now going to be left incomplete, and digital-only titles no longer have a legal way to purchase them. Some games get complete editions, and some games get limited physical editions, but those are mostly the exception and not the norm. So much content is going to be impossible to obtain legally. Years from now, when people buy PS3 games, They will be buying incomplete games at times. That's not a great thing for collecting and is dangerous because of the incompleteness of some games years from now. For some games, story content is locked behind DLC. If it's just updates, sure as disappointing as it is, I can let that go. But not being able to buy DLC is bad news. Story content for plenty of games will not be legally accessible. It's disappointing that we won't be able to legally access some of this content. Imagine 10 years from now you buy a PS3 game to discover you cannot play the entire game due to entire pieces of DLC not being accessible. Granted, that doesn't entirely fall on PlayStation as far as the DLC thing goes. DLC practices are more so an industry issue that needs to be tackled. However, it's just another casualty in the closure of the older PlayStation stores, and it's one that I wanted to lay out here. Of course, it'd be unfair of me to act like this is just a PlayStation issue. It's an industry-wide issue. Just look at Nintendo, for example. So many old Nintendo games lack re-releases, not even just on Switch, but on any previous Nintendo platform. For example, GameCube games. Or how about Xbox? Sure, I praised them earlier for backwards compatibility, but there's plenty of Xbox games missing still. The other major point I wanted to make is, yes, it is not PlayStation's requirement or obligation to preserve everything on their platforms. There's only so much they can do, but I do feel like they could be doing a better job. I'm not asking them to preserve every game and every DLC ever released on a PlayStation platform. Instead, what I want is for PlayStation to put their own older games on newer PlayStations, and try to maybe reach out to publishers and get some of their old games on newer PlayStations too. To briefly touch on one of the main counterpoints to my entire video, yes, you could technically just emulate or hack your console, but that's not ideal. Not everyone will emulate or hack their console, plus it'd be better if we had a legal method to do it with. It'd be pretty neat to play these games on a modern platform in the way that I could recommend to everyone. The other main counterpoint here is how the PS3, PSP, and PS Vita are all old platforms. Yeah, these are all old platforms and the death of their digital stores was inevitable. That's not the main problem here in my opinion. Instead, the main problem is the lack of legacy content available on newer PlayStation consoles, and with the PS3, PSP, and PS Vita all being the last way to experience this PlayStation legacy content legally, it's annoying to see the last remaining bits of good legacy content on PlayStation start to slip away. Overall, to wrap this up, my main point is this. The death of the PlayStation 3, PSP, and Vita stores is bad for all of us due to it meaning a lot more games will become inaccessible. The main problem here is that there is no alternative to getting these games, which is unfortunate due to how many of these games serve a wider audience. While not exclusively a PlayStation problem, it is still a problem that I am focusing on specifically with PlayStation here, due to them being a platform holder with a lot of legacy IP, and also being rumored to be shutting down older digital stores. But that's all for now. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. I'm Fuse, signing out. See ya.